Hi, good evening everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Richard Witt. I'm a principal at Quadrangle Architects. I was working as the lead designer for the Shared Spaces team, working alongside a very large charrette team and a more compact team for the exhibition phase. I'm going to apologize in advance if I seem slightly bleary-eyed. I came last night from Shanghai in the middle of the night, and so I've been up since 3 o'clock this morning with some crazy jet lag. But the subject of our investigation was shared spaces, and our project is called To Go, the People's Grid. I'm going to follow a little bit on what Christopher said there. He's stealing my presentation already. But according to a recent Toronto Life article, Toronto is the 4th most congested region in North America. Chicago. The study concluded that in 2006, the annual cost of congestion to commuters in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area was $3.3 billion, but other estimates put that cost as high as $5 billion or $6 billion. But imagine a 50% increase in that in the next 10 years, and it's likely to happen. According to the Ontario Ministry of Finance, the population of the GTA will increase by 2.8 million or 44.6% to reach almost 9.2 million by 2036. And as is the global trend, there's increased urbanization. By 2036, more than half the province will be living in the GTA alone. And at the same time, transit investment's at an all-time low. The TTC is more reliant on revenues from fares than any other transit system in the developed world. In Toronto, 80% of the TTC's operating budget is paid by riders, compared with 58% in Montreal, 46% in Vancouver, 59% in New York, and 52% in Chicago. The Canada-wide average is 62%. You can see over to my right a recent Global Mail article illustrating the Toronto transit system compared with other cities around the world. And while most are certainly bigger cities, some are not that much bigger, but you can see that ours is a lot smaller. But in the absence of transit funding and investment, what can we do with what we've got? That was the real focus of our charrette. What are the opportunities that are available to us, apart from just imagining a huge windfall? We proposed a proposal for shared spaces in the city core based on 4 principles. The first is the requirement of streets vary from hour to hour, from day to day, and from month to month. The streets and movement across them should reflect that. Secondly, we propose to reduce single occupancy vehicles by encouraging and facilitating attractive multiple travel options. We propose to create streets, streetscapes, and incentives which promote a travel hierarchy. Walking is the easiest and most rewarding, single occupancy vehicles the opposite. In creating a more complicated pattern of mobility and activity, we also need to consider the user experience. That's our 4th principle. So the next few slides are precedents that illustrate some of the thinking that went on to inform our proposal. The first is evident around us, but in very selected instances, streets don't have to be just thoroughfares, they can be more than that. This is probably the most famous example in the city, which is a project of ours, 299 Queen Street, City TV and Much Music. At normal times, the image on the left is Queen Street, just a normal street, but during the Much Music Video Awards, it completely transforms. But that's an extreme example of change. There are additionally more modest examples, such as this, which are pop-up cafes. At certain times of the year, space normally given to street parking can become spaces for social activity. And we hear a lot of talk about complete streets, which is a very important idea, which we looked at, but and I'll discuss this in a minute, we've proposed it in a more dynamic way. Complete streets, but not always at the same time. And this is an idea that rules and signage are not static. To reflect current conditions, weather changes, the speed limits, lane delineation, and rules can all change. This will keep traffic moving as effectively as possible and help to define the street for different purposes. We began to consider modifications to the physical space. This diagram shows the extent of major infrastructure, the subway and the DVP Gardner Expressway as it currently exists. But our vision starts with the development or clarification of mixed-use streets, which become dynamic, complete streets. You can walk, cycle, take urban transit, and enjoy the tree canopy on them. But they're not built for commuting by car, although cars can move through them. We propose to reallocate the distribution of space. This, for example, is a 20-meter right-of-way with 2 traffic lanes of mixed transit and vehicles, bicycle lanes, sidewalks, and on one side parking. But you can see it might be a little bit small, but you can see on this one In the summer, we propose that people can walk a bit further to their cars, and the area designated as street parking in the winter and shoulder seasons could be appropriated on the north side, which will catch the sun, for pop-up cafes or other similar activities. Our next step in creating the dynamic city grid is the redefinition of express routes. We've kept them as Adelaide and Richmond, but redefined them to include designated bike lanes and a designated transit lane. In the north-south direction, LRTs feed east-west routes at the north and south extents of the city core, and surface transit across intermediary east-west major streets. We designate Dufferin, Bathurst, Spadina and Jarvis as LRT routes with adapted Lakeshore LRT connection. Combine this with hubs throughout the city, many already existing, such as car share and Bixi bike sharing, with also bicycle transit stations and compact parking stacks. Streets would take on a dynamic character, like this study done for John Street prepared by the Planning Partnership. In the early morning hours, with sparse traffic and pedestrians, the street would allow for servicing, loading and delivery. But during normal daytime hours, moderate traffic of all forms would be kept moving. In the evenings, the traffic speed would be slowed or stopped to encourage pedestrian-friendly street life, and no service vehicles would be permitted. And on certain nights, part of the street could be closed for a street market with performers and buskers. Or even on the weekends, the street entirely closed to traffic and become a street festival with no bikes or cars or transit permitted. But how would we navigate this dynamic city? Most of us are drivers, pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders, just at different times. You shouldn't care about which company is offering it. You just want to get from here to there in a quick, enjoyable manner. How can we focus on the user experience to create dynamic navigation? Precedents such as the Hong Kong Octopus card, which can be used for transit as well as purchases at fast food outlets and convenience stores. And this parking assistant, accessible via smartphone app, that shows you where the parking spaces are so you don't have to circle looking for a space. This is an idea that car share doesn't have to be a shared car. Individual car owners can share their car. This would mean less parking requirements and efficiency of private vehicles. And this Bixi app for planning your bicycle journey shows you where the station is for pickup and how to best get where you want to go and where to park when you get there. We're going to change the way we use our physical space by changing how we use our virtual space. Applications and smart card technology will transform our travel experience by seamlessly integrating all our needs on all modes of travel. We'll motivate users to leave their cars behind by providing incentives that reward their travel choices but also promote the local economy. I don't know if that's some reason I get the spotlight for saying that. Not only do you get points for taking the TTC, a cab or Bixi, but points will build up which you can exchange for metro passes, coffee or a bouquet of flowers. The app will plan a comprehensive route across the city by feeding live data on traffic, weather, accidents, maintenance, etc. Inputting your origin and destination, you'll be given a multi-platform route which will get you where you want to go the fastest and give you reward points for doing it. The features of real-time travel data, integration of all public services, libraries, rec programs, permits, etc., dynamic pricing for toll roads and parking and even transit, revenue generation based on incentives, retailer payment systems, property development and advertising, stageability, doesn't have to be built all at once, we can do it over time, and community building, which would have events listing. This would all feed into the app. So in summary, we would propose principles which are street activity and mobility varying by time of day or season, a reduction in single occupancy vehicles, travel hierarchy, and a focus on user experience. No longer just a shared physical space, it's now also your personalized travel space. And this is the team that made it happen. Thank you very much.
I can tell you haven't been using the TTC lately. The emphasis on user experience, I think, is an interesting one because it's one of the things that always gets left out of the equation. But of course, for any user, you feel like you're being punished half the time for choosing the better way. Who wants to go first? Ken. Yeah. Ken Greenberg. You have 5 minutes. Yeah, why don't you?
Yes. No, it's all so obvious and so clear that these are the things we have to do. And I think it's a very thoughtful, well-documented, well-put-together exposition of the issue. I'm just going to comment on a few things, and that is, I'll go back to what Chris said about the congestion, and I think we all know the numbers, and I see them up in a lot of the panels in the MOVE exhibit, but it is also palpable on the streets, and it's making people really unhappy. There are angry drivers, frustrated cyclists, pedestrians who feel vulnerable. This is affecting, and very frustrated transit riders who can't get on the streetcars, have to wait 2 or 3 times to get on. So it's now reached a crisis point, and the Board of Trade statistics are staggering when they play out to 2031. I think we're also becoming familiar with those. I think the 4 principles are excellent. I really appreciate, among others, the idea of introducing the time dimension. That rather than thinking of fixed solutions or fixed roles for streets, looking at how they behave over different times. A great example is what Barcelona has done, where all services, deliveries, garbage pickup, and so on happens before 11 a.m. So you do not have that conflict after that hour, which makes it possible for pedestrians to take over many of the street spaces. You have all kinds of examples in other cities of doing that. We're seeing this appear in, there's a great term in French for which there's no good English equivalent, the version sauvage, the wild version of things before they're institutionalized. These things are cropping up all over the city. Anybody who went to Word on the Street, for example, this last weekend and saw Queen's Park and Queen's Park Crescent, all the way from College Street up to Bloor, taken over, it was just sensational. We're seeing the evidence, for example, on Celebrate Young. All the evidence from the business owners has been a huge uptake in business on the street during that period. And if you walk the street, as I have, I worked on a study on Yonge Street. There are lots of places on Yonge Street that I simply didn't know were there because I just walked by without noticing them on the narrow sidewalks. I discovered some restaurants. There's a great Middle Eastern restaurant called Paramount. Phenomenal, which I only discovered because they had an outdoor cafe, and I was tempted to go and sit down there. You could see people's behavior, their body language, the fact that they were there with their kids. So again, I keep coming back to the fact that it's also obvious. It's also obvious, I think everyone knows, Leslie more than anyone else, that we've had decades of failure to make essential investments in transit in this city. And we just have a huge job of catch-up to do, not only in the city, but in the city region. And one of the really important discussions that's going to happen over the next year is to identify reliable funding sources. Taxation. It's a form of taxation. We will have to pay for this, and we really have no choice. I want to just suggest one avenue that you hinted at, or at least you gave some examples of, that I think is cause for optimism. Well, 2 things. One of them is that the Department of Transportation in the U.S. is pointing to some fascinating statistics, and that is that people in Gen X and Gen Y, in very large numbers, are not bothering to get driver's licenses and not buying cars. Among the age cohort of people who can just get their license now up to age 34, we're now up to 26% of people in that age range who are not interested in driving cars at all, and who are making the choice to live their lives differently. So that's one thing. A second thing is the changing attitude to the car, and I really think it's a generational thing, that the idea that your identity, your personal identity, is somehow tied up with the automobile that you own and drive is like the dodo bird. It is disappearing. The younger generations, the 75% or 74% who are driving, are increasingly going to treat the car as an appliance, not as a valued possession. What will be much more valuable to them is the handheld device. That's where their identity is going to be tied up, is the sophistication of their handheld device, not their wheels, as it was in my generation. And what that means is not having to own cars, things like Car2Go and all the various forms of car share, Zipcar, Green Car, by all the various names that those companies go, will, in a much more significant way than I think we've experienced so far, replace car ownership. That has huge implications for parking, which occupies enormous space in our city and gets in the way of appropriate redevelopment, really becomes a barrier for the kind of mixed-use development that we want to pursue. I think we're already starting to see that change. But if you combine that with the octopus card, which you talked about, I think the world we're heading toward in the not too distant future is you will arrive in a city with your handheld device, probably, not even a card, and you will have access to a vehicle, a bicycle, a train, a ferry, a bus. You'll be able to see in real time where all those things are. You'll be able to track the routes. You'll be able to plan your itinerary, and you won't need to own any of those things. And you will use all of them. You won't fall into a category of being a pedestrian, a cyclist, or a driver. You'll do all of the above to the extent that you need to or want to. So I guess what I'm saying is behavior change is it's not just the user experience, it's that people are going to respond to this, and they're already doing so, and it's very much a generational change that we're starting to observe. The last 2 points I want to make are two groups who are getting into the act now in ways that they didn't before. There was a really important statement by the coroner, the Ontario coroner, this past week, who came out strongly advocating the reduction of speeds in cities to 30 kilometers. That was a very significant statement, tying that to fatalities in collisions involving pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers. And the second is the medical officers of health in various cities who are looking at childhood obesity, at diabetes, at heart disease, all occurring in children, and saying that the sedentary lifestyle that goes with an over-reliance on automobile use is a problem. So I'll just finish by saying I think there are a lot of things that are converging that point to some interesting changes, and you pointed out a lot of them.
Leslie Wu has asked to go next.
Thanks, Chris. I figure if I go last, by the time, if Ken covers everything, there'll be nothing left to say. So first of all, thank you to Evergreen for organizing this great event. We are privileged at Metrolinx to be part of this. And thank you to the panelists for being among such illustrious group. And it's fun to spend time with Christopher Hume. So first of all, on the project, thank you to the team that put it together. And I agree with Ken, really crisp, clearly articulated concept. I totally endorse the 4 principles around time, choice, hierarchy, and the traveler-focused experience. In fact, these are principles that we have well integrated into our plan, the big move. Couple observations. In the opening statement, where we talked about the number of people coming here in the next several years, the here is actually not just the city of Toronto. The here is the region. And so I guess my question on the proposition statement, which I think is very strong, is how can we imagine everything that was described by the team occurring in Burlington, Richmond Hill, Oshawa, and I don't name any other place outside Mississauga. And I would say I think I could. Mississauga, I'm a big fan of where the direction that Mississauga is heading because it's trying to move to that piece. But I think it's an important question to ask when we think about this idea of shared spaces, that it is, there are places in our region that have an inherent structure that enable much more easily the concept that is put forward, and some where it's a lot more difficult. Not difficult necessarily physically, because we have some very wide right-of-ways in Durham and outside of the city, because there's space. And in fact, it's the opposite problem, is how to animate when you have so much space, and you want to share the space, and you want to create all these choices, and you want to have the kind of pictures that you're imagining. So I think that's, to me, a question about the project. The other thing that is interesting to the premise of structure, again, in the proposal, is when you talked about the different types of the red, green, blue lines and the restructuring of the uses, I got a little bit of concern or caution because it reminded me of planners back in the whenever, whatever, that started to delaminate cities by use and try to overly structure how we think about our cities. And I think there's a lot of room, or we need to leave a lot of room for organic activity. And so there's a balance, because of course we can't have mayhem and chaos, but at the same time, we see in many other cities the shortcomings of overly one-way streets, because we thought it would make the traffic flow a lot faster and we could concentrate certain types of activities in certain corridors. And I think in principle I kind of understand it, but I think it's one of those things that we have to apply very cautiously. So that's one of the things I would say about that. The other thing that I was interested in understanding in the concept of shared space is how landscape and open space and parks are part of that complete street, and nobody talked about it, and I spent a lot of years working in the Parks Department, so I have to shout out for urban forestry, and just to understand, and I'm sure there was lots of discussions in the group, I know that they were very multidisciplinary, so I think talking about this concept in that way, I think would be also really, really interesting. One of the other thoughts I had when you represented it, it's sort of like it's a timeshare, the idea of time. So like, condos, timeshare, if we treated the space in a timeshare way. So then I started segueing my thinking to so how is it shared costs? How does this work now if we have so many multiple users, from far, from near, people that live there, people that come here, people that are tourists that visit? How is it that we make this workable from an economic standpoint? And is there a concept in the shared space concept that can parallel in terms of shared costs? And that's my segue to the whole point that all of this is, we have to figure out how to pay for it. And how do we ensure that there's both sort of public-private revenue generating elements that make it all make sense. But so these are all the thoughts that were going through my mind when I saw the project, and I'm very excited about it. I think it's got a great foundation, and I like the fact that it talks about a hierarchy of use, and that it is multimodal, multivariable, and also to Ken's point, that each of us are not car users only, or walkers only, or cyclists only, or only drive in downtown. If you have a family like mine, you're a weekend warrior to every arena in the region, and during the week you're short distance to where you work, and in the evening you want to. So we all have, and our lives are becoming much more complex. So the idea that we have to share the space with each other and ourselves in many more complex permutations, I think means that the idea of the project is very progressive in how it tries to reflect where we're going, and those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, I'll just be
Toby's coming next.
Sorry, I'll just be relatively brief because a lot of people, when it comes to transit, will say, what's the airport guy doing here? What am I doing here? Well, it's interesting, just to put some perspective on why the airport would care about it. We have roughly 65,000 vehicle trips to the airport every day. We have 40,000 people work at the airport, and that's at a current level of 34 million passengers. We project that once we get to a level of about 50 million passengers, we're talking 60,000 people working. They come from all over, so we look at a wide range, and I was just saying to Leslie what the interesting thing was that, very exciting concepts, but the map stopped at one spot. We are also a $100 million parking business, and that's because the nature of the traffic and the travel that we've got is currently very car dependent. We don't think, frankly, it's sustainable. We don't see how it is that you're going to be able to have a city that's got that many people still reliant on the vehicle. But mobility is incredibly important to the people who use the airport. They depend on it because that is always their first trip to wherever. You just came back from Shanghai. I mean, you didn't materialize at the airport. You actually traveled there somehow. And the attractiveness of business is the attractiveness of a city to business does depend on that mobility. The one thing that I would say about what I was looking, and being a downtown guy, I absolutely love it. I mean, absolutely terrific. I get concerned about the incredibly interconnectedness of our region, and that we have to look at that concept of hubs, Pearson being one of them, which drive traffic, which drive and support other routes that you're getting. So that the idea that you would stop an LRT, like currently planned, not coming to Pearson, to me boggles the mind. I mean, we have a huge catchment area of employees. The other thing is we need, because we're employing so many people, cheap transit. I don't want to require employees the 40,000, the 50,000. I want to charge them parking. I'd like them to be able to get there by transit. So the point that I would like to just remind people is that wider web that's out there that we have to make sure is addressed through this. You have to recognize that interconnectedness and that people rely on it. But it is very exciting, as I say, for a downtown guy, that's terrific. I get a little worried, as Leslie suggested, about how that is applied out in the burbs, where people are still very much dependent upon their vehicle because it didn't occur to them to do this, and they're desperately trying.
But I don't think that this should exactly be all of us agreeing with the four principles. I think we should take a few seconds and ask a few questions. And we should ask the same question over and over again. And I think the question should be why. Well, let's start with how. How are we going to pay for this? And then let's start with the next question is why. So why are we doing this? Why? So I wrote down a couple of points. I think correct me if I'm wrong. It costs us $3.3 billion in congestion. So congestion costs us money. We are the fourth most congested region in North America, or will be soon. 9.2 million people by 2056, and that'll be half the population of the province of Ontario. A significant engine in the Canadian economy, that's for sure. So Why? Those are good reasons. It's a good place to start. So let's go on to our first principle. Why street activity, changing hour of day, time of day, season, month, whichever way you want to think of it. Why? Is it because of 9 to 5? Is it because we don't have people living near their work? Is it because we don't offer things that people in suburbia want that they can't get downtown? So the question is why? And if we ask the question why, I think you get a more holistic approach than just looking at changing one-way streets to at different times of day, to different seasons, etc. I think we have to ask those questions because that gets you to the root cause. The root cause of the problem, what is it? I don't have an answer. I'm just asking, what is the root cause? There are other things I think we can do beyond just changing the hours of the day and the seasonality, directions of the roads, et cetera, speed limits, et cetera, et cetera. We need to incent those other types of behaviors so that we lessen the load, the congestion in general. Number 2, I think that was the one vehicle, the one occupant in the vehicle. Ask the question, why? Why do people think they need to drive on their own in a vehicle X number of kilometers every day, whether it's going to work or whatever? Why? Have we created the incentives so that people don't do that? Have we created incentives for people not to take one person in one vehicle? I think we need to approach it from that perspective as well. The travel hierarchy. Well, that one comes down to how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for that? And why should we do it? So why should we do it? Is it because we're moving people to locations where they can't get the goods and services that they plan to get close to home? Is it because they need to move for sources of entertainment? What's the reason that we need that travel hierarchy? And then the user experience, which I thought was the most interesting. I've never thought of anything at all like that. And I think that just opens up the door to more possibilities when you think of why. I thought your examples were amazing. But if we say why are we going to improve the user experience, what can we do from that perspective? I think it gives us a more holistic solution to this. But I thought your four principles were excellent.
I'll be fairly brief as well. I love the 4 principles. I think they're great. It's obviously a direction that as a society we need to move in. For business, it may have some problematic areas that need to be addressed, and I'm sure a lot of them have been thought of. But we need to look at it beyond just our area. It really is a global problem, and companies like ours, we're a bellwether for congestion. As every time congestion increases, we have to add staff, whether that's another vehicle, whether that's another employee that's delivering from a vehicle on foot, on cycle, whatever. We have a very dramatic effect on our cost as congestion increases, which then we have to increase the cost to our users, be them shippers, be them receivers. We would love to see congestion go down. Productivity of a driver in downtown Toronto is a fraction of what that same driver might be able to do in, say, downtown Waterloo. They just can't move their vehicle, make the deliveries on as timely a basis and as efficiently. Companies like us are looking at all kinds of things to try to bring efficiencies. You'll see a tremendous number of delivery people who walk all day and take the subway and use alternate means to get deliveries off. The time of day deliveries is something that gets talked about a lot. And it's something that could affect a lot of problems. If deliveries were done early in the morning, 5 a.m. deliveries for all couriers, it would take a huge volume off the road. But is that practical? There's a lot of things that would have to happen. Business would need to change its expectations. Companies would have to open, they'd have to have 2 employees in at 5 a.m. Because of health and safety issues. Expectations of delivery times from Vancouver to Toronto may have to increase because the trucks have to go on the road earlier. May not be the end of the world, but it's something that business would have to embrace and plan for. It could solve a lot of problems. I really liked when you talked about the user experience, and one of the things that came to mind inside of all our vehicles, and I'm sure a lot of our competitors, we all have computers on board, monitoring everything. What if we were sharing that information with the wider community so that we're going down Dundas and there's an accident and nobody can get through, that information is shared to the wider community and fewer people drive down Dundas that day. I think there's a lot of opportunities for public and private partnership. We all win when things like that happen. That's really my point.
Okay. I just want to make a comment or two, if I may. And the discussion has focused quite understandably on the enormous cost of doing anything about our transit woes. But I wanted to remind ourselves here tonight that in fact that doesn't always have to be the case. I mean, we think in terms of subway lines and LRT lines. Bicycles are also a form of transit. Walking is also a form of transit. And you know, I did a bit of research a couple of weeks ago about the Two Kings, the project that was initiated back in the 90s, I guess, perhaps the 80s, maybe earlier. And the point being that through a simple change in the, maybe not simple, but through a change of the zoning regulations and therefore a change in how areas of the city are used, people suddenly end up living and working in much closer proximity than would ever have been possible. They don't need cars. That's why these figures are telling us now that young people don't think of a car as being the priority that we did and our parents did. They don't need them, and they're expensive. And the great myth, of course, is that the car is mobility, the car is liberation. It's the exact opposite. To be free of the car and all the conditions that come with it is truly to be liberated. The second thing I just wanted to mention is that let me just finish that thought. We mustn't get hung up on cost because, Metrolinx is going to have to come clean at some point and tell us how we're going to pay for it all. And that's what the debate will be about. But as I say, there are many other strategies that we can use. And faced with the billions of dollars that we need to spend, it's too easy to say no, and we will. We have a history of that. So I worry about that. The other thing I want to point out is a lot of this stuff is already happening. The very nice idea about using streets differently at different times of the day. I got my first lesson in that many years ago when a daughter of mine was at the National Ballet School, which was on Maitland Street, which runs east-west between Church and Jarvis. And whenever I would go there, it was full of little girls and their parents and their teachers. But I later found out when I had a tour of the city given by a reformed drug addict and child prostitute, that if you go there at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's where all the boy hookers hang out. This was completely unknown to me, but this apparently is known to that community. So I don't think that enters into the thoughts of the people at the ballet school very often, but these two parallel universes coexist on this little tiny street right here in the city of Toronto. Maybe that's not the kind of dynamic use we'd like to think of. Nevertheless, it's an example, a good example of the process which is already well underway.